The sun was setting on a quiet Tuesday evening when director Angela Washington finished her weekly visit with her mother in the small town of Millbrook. At 52, Angela had climbed to the highest position in federal law enforcement, but to her mother, she was still just the little girl who used to help tend the garden behind their old house. Angela's black sedan hummed smoothly along the tree-lined streets as she made her way toward the highway. She had changed from her usual business attire into comfortable jeans and a dark blue hoodie for the drive back to Washington. The radio played soft jazz, and she found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Being the first black woman to lead the FBI came with pressures that never seemed to ease, but these quiet moments driving through familiar neighborhoods always helped clear her mind. The engine made a strange coughing sound just as she passed the town's main shopping district. Angela frowned and tapped the gas pedal gently, but the car jerked forward reluctantly. She had been meaning to take it in for service, but her schedule had been packed with congressional hearings and security briefings. The coughing grew worse, and she could smell something burning. "Come on," she whispered to the car, steering toward the curb. "Not tonight." The sedan rolled to a stop on Maple Street, right in front of a row of expensive houses with perfectly manicured lawns. Angela turned off the engine and sat for a moment, looking around the neighborhood. This was the wealthy part of town, where the houses cost more than most people made in 5 years. She had grown up just 10 minutes away, but it might as well have been a different world. She pulled out her phone to call roadside assistance, but there was barely any signal. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the pavement. Angela grabbed her purse and stepped out of the car, walking around to the front to lift the hood. Maybe it was something simple she could fix herself. The engine was hot, and steam rose from somewhere near the radiator. She waved the steam away and leaned in closer, trying to see what might be wrong. Growing up, her father had taught her basic car maintenance, though she rarely needed to use those skills anymore. She was so focused on the engine that she didn't notice the police car that had pulled up behind her. Officer Danny Rodriguez had been patrolling this area for 15 years. He knew every house, every car that belonged here, and every person who had a right to be walking these streets. When he saw a young black woman bent over the hood of a car in front of the Mitchell residence, his first thought wasn't that she might need help. His mind went somewhere else entirely. Rodriguez was 45 years old and had joined the force straight out of high school. He came from a family of cops and had learned early that you had to be suspicious of everyone, especially people who looked out of place. Over the years, that suspicion had hardened into something darker, though he would never admit it to himself. He saw himself as a protector of the community, someone who kept the wrong element from disturbing the peace. He pulled his patrol car up slowly, keeping his headlights on Angela's car. She looked up when she heard the engine, squinting against the bright lights. Rodriguez studied her through his windshield. She was well dressed for someone up to no good, he thought, but that didn't mean anything. Sometimes the smart criminals dress nice to blend in. Angela straightened up and raised her hand in a small wave, assuming the officer had stopped to offer assistance. She had dealt with law enforcement her entire career and generally had positive relationships with local police departments. It never occurred to her that this encounter might go differently. Rodriguez stepped out of his car, his hand resting casually on his belt near his radio. He was a big man, over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that his uniform made look even more imposing in the dim light. He had learned that his size often solved problems before they started. "Evening," he called out as he approached. His voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Angela was surprised by the tone but kept her voice friendly. "Good evening, officer. My car broke down and I was just trying to see what's wrong with it. I think it might be the radiator." Rodriguez stopped about 10 feet away from her, his eyes scanning the car and then moving back to study her face. Something about her calm manner bothered him. Most people got nervous when police showed up, especially if they were somewhere they shouldn't be. "This your car?" he asked, though he had already decided it probably wasn't. "Yes, it is," Angela replied, a note of confusion creeping into her voice. She gestured toward the vehicle. "It started making noise about a mile back and then it just died on me. I was hoping it was something simple." Rodriguez stepped closer, shining his flashlight over the car's interior through the passenger window. It was clean, expensive looking. The kind of car that cost more than he made in 6 months. His suspicion grew stronger. "You live around here?" he asked, though he was pretty sure he knew the answer. "No, I was visiting my mother across town. I live in Washington." Angela was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but she tried to stay cooperative. In her position, she understood how important it was to maintain good relationships with local law enforcement. "Washington," Rodriguez repeated, as if the word itself was suspicious. "Long way from home. What brings you to this particular neighborhood?" Angela gestured toward the car again. "Like I said, my car broke down. This is just where it happened." "To stop running." Rodriguez nodded slowly, but his expression made it clear he wasn't buying her story. He had heard plenty of excuses over the years, and they all sounded reasonable until you dug deeper. He walked around to the back of her car, shining his light on the license plates and writing down the numbers in his notepad. "I'm going to need to see some identification," he said. Returning to stand in front of her, Angela reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. She handed him her driver's license, along with her FBI identification, though she kept the federal ID slightly behind the state license. She had learned over the years that leading with her FBI credentials could sometimes make situations more complicated than they needed to be. Rodriguez took the driver's license and glanced at it briefly before looking back at her. "Angela Washington," he read aloud. "Says here you live in Arlington." "That's right." He studied the photo and then looked at her face again, as if trying to catch her in some kind of deception. The address was consistent with her story, but that didn't mean she was telling the truth about everything else. "What kind of work do you do in Washington?" he asked, handing the license back but continuing to watch her closely. "I work for the government," Angela replied simply. She had learned to give vague answers in casual conversations. Most people didn't need to know the specifics of her job, and it often raised more questions than it answered. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed. Government work could mean anything, and in his experience, it usually meant something that wasn't quite legal. He had arrested plenty of people who claimed to have legitimate jobs, but turned out to be involved in all kinds of criminal activity. The whole situation felt wrong to him. An expensive car, a woman who seemed too calm, too prepared with her answers. He had developed instincts about these things over the years, and those instincts were telling him there was more to this story than a simple breakdown. "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle," he said, his voice taking on a more official tone. "I want to take a look around, make sure everything's on the level." Angela felt her heart rate increase slightly. This was not going the way she had expected. "Officer, I'm not sure why that's necessary. I've shown you my identification, and I've explained what happened. Is there some problem?" Rodriguez didn't like the way she questioned his authority. In his experience, innocent people didn't ask questions when police wanted to search their property. They cooperated fully and let the officers do their job. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to step back and let me handle this," he said firmly. "I have a right to ensure there's nothing dangerous in this vehicle, especially given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" Angela asked, her professional training kicking in despite her personal situation. "I'm not aware of any circumstances that would justify a search." That was exactly the wrong thing to say. Rodriguez had heard those words before, usually from people who had something to hide and thought they were smarter than the police. The fact that she knew legal terminology only confirmed his suspicions that she wasn't who she claimed to be. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to step away from the vehicle," he said, his hand moving closer to his radio. "If you continue to be uncooperative, this situation is going to get a lot more complicated for both of us." Angela took a slow breath and stepped back from her car, raising her hand slightly to show she wasn't reaching for anything. 25 years in law enforcement had taught her how quickly situations could spiral out of control, and she recognized the signs of an officer who had already made up his mind about what he was dealing with. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job," she said calmly, "but I want to be clear that I'm cooperating fully. I just want to understand what's happening here." Rodriguez watched her carefully as she moved away from the vehicle. Her calm demeanor bothered him more than if she had been nervous or scared. Most innocent people got flustered when police started asking questions, but she seemed almost too composed, like someone who had been through this before. He approached her car and began looking through the windows with his flashlight. The interior was immaculate. Leather seats, expensive-looking electronics, everything clean and organized. On the passenger seat, he could see a designer handbag that probably cost more than most people may in a month. "Nice car," he said, more to himself than to her. "Must have cost a pretty penny." Angela didn't respond. She had learned that sometimes the best thing to do in situations like this was to say as little as possible and let the officer work through whatever process he felt he needed to follow. Rodriguez tried the driver's door and found it unlocked. He opened it and leaned inside, shining his light around the interior. The car still smelled new, and everything was exactly where it should be. But that didn't mean anything. Some criminals were very good at maintaining appearances. "You mind telling me how you can afford a car like this on a government salary?" he asked, straightening up to look at her. The question hit Angela like a slap. She had worked her entire life to get where she was, starting with student loans for college and law school, then climbing through the ranks of federal law enforcement, one case at a time. Every promotion had been earned through late nights, difficult investigations, and proving herself over and over again in a field dominated by men. "I've been working for 25 years, she said simply. "I've been fortunate in my career." Rodriguez made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Must be some career. What kind of government work pays for cars like this?" Angela felt her patience beginning to wear thin, but she kept her voice level. "I'm in law enforcement." "Law enforcement," Rodriguez repeated, his tone making it clear what he thought of that claim. "What kind of law enforcement?" "Federal law enforcement." Rodriguez had heard that story before too. Half the drug dealers he arrested claimed to be working undercover for some federal agency or another. It was always the FBI or the DEA or some other organization that regular cops couldn't easily check up on. He leaned back into the car and started looking more thoroughly. In the center console, he found registration papers that matched her driver's license, but paperwork could be forged. In the glove compartment, he discovered what looked like official documents, but the print was too small to read clearly in the dim light. "Step over here," he called to Angela, motioning toward the front of his patrol car where his headlights would illuminate her better. "I want to ask you a few more questions." Angela walked over to where he indicated, feeling more uncomfortable. With each passing moment, she could see neighbors starting to peer out their windows, drawn by the flashing lights of the police car. A few people had come out onto their porches to get a better look at what was happening. Rodriguez followed her, his radio crackling occasionally with dispatches from other parts of town. He studied her in the brighter light, taking in details he had missed before. Her jeans were expensive, her shoes were designer, and that hoodie was probably worth more than his uniform. Everything about her screamed money, but that just made him more suspicious. "So you're telling me you're some kind of federal agent," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "I told you I work in federal law enforcement. Doing what exactly? Angela hesitated. The truth was complicated, and she wasn't sure this officer was ready to hear it. But she also wasn't going to lie. I'm an administrator, she said finally. I oversee operations, Rodriguez snorted. Administrator. That's a fancy way of saying you push papers around. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, and Angela felt her professional composure slip slightly. She had spent her entire career fighting against people who assumed she didn't belong, who thought her success was somehow unearned or illegitimate. Officer Rodriguez, she said, reading his name tag. I appreciate that you're trying to do your job, but I've been more than cooperative. I've shown you my identification, I've answered your questions, and I've allowed you to search my vehicle. I'm not sure what else you need from me. The fact that she knew his name when he hadn't introduced himself made Rodriguez even more suspicious. He looked down at his name tag and then back at her face. Maybe she had dealt with police before. Maybe she made it her business to remember the names of officers who had questioned her. I need to know what you're really doing in this neighborhood, he said firmly. And I need to know how someone who claims to be a government paper pusher can afford to drive around in a car that costs more than most people's houses. Angela felt a flash of anger but pushed it down. Getting emotional would only make things worse. Officer, I've told you the truth. My car broke down while I was driving home from visiting my mother. That's all there is to it. Rodriguez walked back to her car and looked inside again. This time he opened the passenger door and reached for her purse. Angela took a step forward instinctively. I need to see what's in here, he said, holding up the bag. Officer, I don't consent to you searching my personal belongings. Rodriguez paused, the purse in his hands. He had been hoping she wouldn't know enough to object, but clearly she was more informed about her rights than he had expected. That just confirmed his suspicions that she had been through this process before. Ma'am, I have reasonable suspicion that there may be contraband in this vehicle, he said, using the formal language he had learned in training. I'm authorized to conduct a search for officer safety purposes. Angela knew that was a stretch of the legal definition, but she also knew that arguing about it on the street wasn't going to get her anywhere. The best thing to do was let him conduct his search, find nothing, and then be on her way. Fine, she said. But I want it noted that I'm not consenting to this search. Rodriguez opened her purse and began looking through it methodically. Wallet, keys, phone, makeup, the usual things women carried. But then his flashlight illuminated something that made him pause. In a small zippered compartment, he found a prescription bottle. He pulled it out and held it up to the light, reading the label. The name on the prescription matched her driver's license, but the medication name was something he didn't recognize. It sounded medical official, but Rodriguez had learned that drug dealers sometimes got prescriptions for legitimate medications and then sold them on the street. What's this for? He asked, holding up the bottle. It's prescription medication, Angela replied, for a medical condition. What kind of medical condition? Angela felt invaded by the question, but she tried to remain cooperative. It's for high blood pressure. It's a very common medication. Rodriguez shook the bottle and heard pills rattling inside. The prescription was recent, filled just 2 weeks ago at a pharmacy in Arlington, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. Criminals. We're getting more sophisticated all the time. You got a lot of pills in here, he observed. It's a 30-day supply. I just picked it up. Rodriguez looked at the bottle again, then at Angela, then back at the bottle. Something about the whole situation still felt wrong to him. The expensive car, the designer clothes, the way she seemed to know exactly what to say and how to act. It all pointed to someone who was more than they appeared to be. I'm going to need to call this in, he said, reaching for his radio. Get someone down here to take a closer look at what we've got. Angela felt her heart sink. She could see where this was heading, and she knew that once backup arrived, the situation would become much more complicated. More officers meant more opportunities for misunderstandings, more chances for things to go wrong. "Officer Rodriguez, that's really not necessary," she said. "You can call the pharmacy if you want to verify the prescription. You can run my license through whatever system you need to. But I promise you, there's nothing illegal happening here." Rodriguez was already keying his radio. "Unit 12-2. Dispatch. Go ahead, Unit 12. I need a backup unit to my location on Maple Street. I've got a suspicious person here, and I want another set of eyes on the situation." "Copy that, Unit 12. Unit 7 is about 5 minutes out." Rodriguez clipped his radio back to his belt and looked at Angela with satisfaction. "Won't be long now. We'll get this all sorted out." Angela stood in the glare of the headlights, watching neighbors whisper to each other on their porches, feeling the weight of assumptions and prejudices that had followed her throughout her career. She thought about her mother, probably wondering why she hadn't called to say she had made it home safely. She thought about the meetings she had scheduled for the next morning, the important decisions that were waiting for her attention. The sound of another police car approaching made Angela's stomach tighten. She watched as the second patrol vehicle pulled up behind Officer Rodriguez's car, its red and blue lights adding to the scene that was already drawing more attention from the neighborhood. A few people had even come out of their houses and were standing on the sidewalk, trying to get a better view of what was happening. Officer Kevin Park stepped out of the backup unit. He was younger than Rodriguez, maybe in his early 30s, with the eager attitude of someone who still believed police work was about helping people. But he also trusted his partner's judgment, and if Rodriguez thought something was suspicious, then Park was ready to back him up. "What do we have here?" Park asked, walking over to where Rodriguez stood holding Angela's prescription bottle. "Found this in her purse," Rodriguez said, handing over the medication. "Claims it's for high blood pressure, but I want to get it checked out. Something doesn't feel right about this whole situation." Park looked at the bottle, reading the label in the bright light from their patrol cars. The prescription looked legitimate enough to him, but he had learned to trust Rodriguez's instincts. The older officer had been doing this job a lot longer, and had caught plenty of criminals who seemed innocent at first glance. Angela watched the two officers whispering to each other and felt a growing sense of dread. She had been in law enforcement long enough to know how these situations could snowball. Once police officers convinced themselves that someone was guilty of something, it became very difficult to change their minds. "Officers," she said, trying to keep her voice calm and professional, "I really think there's been a misunderstanding. Here, if you want to verify my prescription, you can call my doctor or the pharmacy. But I assure you, everything is completely legal." Rodriguez looked up from his conversation with Park. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to be patient while we sort this out. There are procedures we have to follow." "What procedures?" Angela asked. "I've shown you my identification. I've cooperated with your search, and I've answered all your questions. What exactly are you investigating?" The question seemed to irritate Rodriguez. He didn't like having his authority questioned, especially by someone he suspected of criminal activity. In his mind, innocent people didn't ask so many questions about police procedures. "We're investigating suspicious activity in this neighborhood," he said firmly. "And right now, you're part of that investigation." Park had been examining the prescription bottle more closely. The medication name was long and complicated, the kind of thing that could be a controlled substance. He had arrested people before who had legitimate prescriptions, but were selling their pills on the street. It was becoming a bigger problem every year. "How many pills are you supposed to take?" Park asked Angela. "One in the morning, one at night," she replied. "It's a very standard dosage for blood pressure medication. You can look it up if you want." Rodriguez took the bottle back from Park and shook it again. "Sounds like a lot of pills for someone to be carrying around." Angela felt her patience wearing thin. "It's a 30-day supply. That's how prescriptions work. You fill them once a month. Or you fill them and then sell them, Rodriguez said quietly, but loud enough for her to hear. The accusation hit Angela like a physical blow. In all her years of law enforcement, through all the difficult cases and dangerous situations she had handled, she had never been accused of drug dealing. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it weren't happening to her. "Officer, that's a serious accusation," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge, "and it's completely false. I am not involved in any illegal drug activity." Rodriguez noticed the change in her tone and interpreted it as defensiveness. Guilty people always got angry when you got close to the truth. He had seen it 1,000 times before. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back," he said, reaching for his handcuffs. Angela stared at him in disbelief. "You're arresting me?" "I'm detaining you while we investigate this situation further." "On what grounds?" Rodriguez had been hoping she wouldn't ask that question. The truth was, his grounds were shaky at best. But he had committed to this course of action, and backing down now would make him look weak in front of his partner and the growing crowd of onlookers. "Suspicion of drug possession," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Angela's mind raced through her options. She could reveal her true identity right now and put an end to this whole situation. But part of her wanted to see how far these officers were willing to take their assumptions. She had spent her career fighting against exactly this kind of bias, and experiencing it firsthand was giving her insights she had never had before. "Officer, I'm telling you that medication is legally prescribed to me by my doctor. You have no grounds to arrest me." "Turn around," Rodriguez said more firmly, pulling out his handcuffs. Angela looked at Park, hoping the younger officer might show some common sense. "Officer Park, you can see this is wrong. I haven't committed any crime." Park shifted uncomfortably. The whole situation felt like it was moving too fast, but Rodriguez was the senior officer, and he didn't want to undermine his partner in front of a suspect. If Rodriguez thought an arrest was necessary, then Park would support him. "Ma'am, please." "Cooperate," Park said quietly. Angela realized she was out of options. These officers had made up their minds, and nothing she said was going to change that. She turned around slowly and put her hands behind her back, feeling the cold metal of the handcuffs as Rodriguez snapped them onto her wrists. "You're making a mistake," she said as Rodriguez tightened the cuffs. "We'll see about that," Rodriguez replied. He was feeling more confident now that she was in custody. The hardest part was over, and now they could take their time sorting out the details. The handcuffs were tighter than they needed to be, and Angela could feel them cutting into her wrists. She had put handcuffs on plenty of suspects over the years, but she had always tried to be professional about it. Rodriguez seemed to be enjoying the process a little too much. "This is completely unnecessary," Angela said as Rodriguez guided her toward his patrol car. "That's what they all say," Rodriguez replied. He opened the back door of his car and put his hand on Angela's head to guide her inside. Pushing down harder than was required, Angela found herself sitting in the back seat of a police car for the first time in her life. The plastic seats were uncomfortable, and the cage separating the front and back seats made her feel trapped. She could see the crowd of neighbors getting larger, and she noticed that several people were holding up their phones, recording the arrest. Rodriguez got into the driver's seat and looked at her in the rearview mirror. "You want to tell me what you were really doing in this neighborhood?" "I told you the truth. My car broke down." "Right," Rodriguez said sarcastically. "Just happened to break down in front of one of the most expensive houses in town. What a coincidence." Angela stared out the window at her disabled car, wondering how a simple mechanical problem had turned into this nightmare. Her phone was still in her purse, which was now evidence in whatever case Rodriguez thought he was building against her. Park got into the passenger seat and looked back at Angela. "Ma'am, if you cooperate with us, this will go a lot easier. We just want to understand what's going on." "I've been cooperating from the beginning," Angela replied. "I've told you the truth about everything. I'm not a criminal." Rodriguez started the engine. "We'll let the people at the station sort that out. They're good at getting to the bottom of things." As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Angela watched her disabled sedan disappearing behind them. She thought about her mother, who would be worried when she didn't call. She thought about her staff at the FBI, who would wonder why she hadn't responded to the messages that were probably piling up on her phone. Most of all, she thought about how quickly everything had changed. 2 hours ago, she had been a respected federal official heading home from a pleasant visit with her mother. Now she was sitting in the back of a police car, handcuffed and accused of drug dealing. All because these officers couldn't see past their own prejudices. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent her entire career working to reform exactly these kinds of problems in law enforcement. She had written policies, conducted training sessions, and given speeches about the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or appearance. Now she was experiencing firsthand what happened when those lessons weren't learned. Rodriguez was humming quietly to himself as he drove toward the station. In his mind, this was a good arrest. He had trusted his instincts, followed proper procedures, and taken a suspected drug dealer off the streets. The fact that she seemed educated and well-dressed just proved how sophisticated criminals had become. Park was less confident about the whole situation. Something about it still bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. The woman in the back seat didn't act like the drug dealers he usually arrested. She was too calm, too articulate, too knowledgeable about police procedures. But Rodriguez had more experience, and if he thought this arrest was justified, then Park would trust his judgment. That was how partnerships worked in police work. You backed up your partner. The Millbrook Police Station was a small building that had been built in the 1970s and hadn't been updated much since then. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, and the linoleum floors were worn down from decades of foot traffic. Angela found herself sitting in a holding cell that smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee, still wearing the handcuffs that Rodriguez had refused to remove. "For officer safety," he had said when she asked why they were still necessary. Angela had been in enough police stations to know that was nonsense, but she had stopped arguing. Every word she said seemed to make these officers more convinced that she was hiding something. The holding cell was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with a concrete bench along one wall and a metal toilet in the corner. Angela had never imagined she would see the inside of one of these rooms from this perspective. She had visited plenty of suspects in holding cells over the years, but always as the person asking the questions, never as the person waiting to be questioned. Rodriguez was at his desk in the main room, filling out paperwork and feeling pleased with himself. He had called his supervisor to report the arrest, describing Angela as a suspected drug dealer who was casing houses in the wealthy part of town. He had also put in a request to have her prescription medication tested, though that would take several days to come back from the lab. Park sat at his own desk nearby, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong about this whole situation. The woman in the holding cell didn't seem like any drug dealer he had ever arrested. She was too calm, too professional, too knowledgeable about her rights. But Rodriguez was convinced they had caught someone important, and Park didn't want to second-guess his partner. Angela had been sitting in the cell for almost an hour when she finally decided she had experienced enough of this situation. She had learned what she needed to learn about how these officers operated, and now it was time to put an end to the charade. "Officer Rodriguez," she called out. "I need to make a phone call." Rodriguez looked up from his paperwork. "You'll get your phone call when we're ready to give it to you." "Actually, I'm entitled to make a phone call immediately upon arrest." "That's basic constitutional law," Rodriguez frowned. There she went again with the legal terminology. Most people didn't know the specifics of their rights. but she seemed to have them memorized. It just confirmed his suspicions that she had been arrested before. "Fine," he said, getting up from his desk. "One phone call. Make it count." He led Angela to an old rotary phone that sat on a desk in a corner of the station. Her hands were still, cuffed behind her back, so Rodriguez had to hold the phone for her while she gave him the number to dial. 202-324-3000, Angela said clearly. Rodriguez dialed the number and waited for someone to answer. After a few rings, a professional-sounding woman's voice came on the line. "FBI headquarters, how may I direct your call?" Rodriguez felt his blood run cold. He looked at Angela with new eyes, suddenly wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. But there could be lots of reasons why someone would call the FBI. Maybe she was trying to report a crime, or maybe she was calling in a favor from someone she knew. "Director Washington's office, please," Angela said calmly. Rodriguez's hand started to shake slightly as he held the phone. "Director Washington?" He looked at the woman standing next to him, trying to process what he was hearing. "This is Special Agent Collins in the director's office," came the voice from the phone. "How can I help you?" Angela spoke clearly and calmly. "Agent Collins, this is Director Washington. I'm currently being held at the Millbrook Police Station on Route 15, about 40 minutes outside the city. I need you to contact Chief Morrison here immediately and verify my identity." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ma'am, did you say you're Director Washington?" "That's correct. I was arrested about an hour ago on false charges, and I need this situation resolved quickly and quietly." Agent Collins' voice became urgent. "Director, are you safe? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine, Agent Collins. Just get me out of here." Rodriguez hung up the phone with a trembling hand. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. This woman couldn't possibly be the director of the FBI. That was impossible. The director was someone important, someone powerful. Not some woman he had found on the street with a broken-down car. "What kind of game are you playing?" he asked Angela, but his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. Angela looked at him with an expression that was calm, but somehow also intimidating. "No game, Officer Rodriguez. I am exactly who I just told them I am." Park had been listening to the conversation from his desk, and now he walked over to join them. "Rodriguez, what's going on?" Before Rodriguez could answer, the phone on Chief Morrison's desk started ringing. Morrison was a 50-year-old man who had been running the Millbrook Police Department for 8 years. He was generally competent, but had never had to deal with anything more serious than drunk driving arrests and the occasional domestic dispute. Morrison picked up his phone. "Chief Morrison. Chief Morrison, this is Deputy Director Phillips from FBI headquarters. We understand that you're currently holding Director Angela Washington at your facility." Morrison felt his stomach drop. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "Director Angela Washington, the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was arrested by your officers approximately 1 hour ago. We need her released immediately." Morrison looked across the room at Rodriguez and Park, who were both staring at the woman in handcuffs. There must be some mistake. "We arrested a woman for suspected drug possession. She can't be the FBI director." "Chief Morrison, I'm going to send you Director Washington's official photograph right now. Check your email. And I'm also dispatching 2 agents to your location to escort the director back to headquarters. They should arrive within 30 minutes. Morrison hung up the phone and immediately opened his email on his computer. Within seconds, an official FBI photograph appeared on his screen. It showed a professional-looking African-American woman in a business suit, standing in front of an American flag. It was unmistakably the same woman who was currently handcuffed in his police station. Morrison felt like he might throw up. In his 8 years as chief, he had never faced anything close to this kind of disaster. He had just arrested the head of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country. His career was probably over, and his department would be lucky to survive the scandal. "Rodriguez," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Get over here, now." Rodriguez walked over to Morrison's desk, still trying to convince himself that this was all some kind of elaborate con game. "Chief, this woman is trying to pull some kind of scam. She can't possibly be who she says she is." Morrison turned his computer screen so Rodriguez could see the photograph. "Does this look familiar to you?" Rodriguez stared at the screen, and the last of his confidence drained away. It was her. There was no doubt about it. The woman he had arrested for drug dealing was actually the director of the FBI. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Apparently not," Morrison said grimly. He stood up and walked over to Angela, who was still standing by the phone. "Ma'am, I am so sorry about this misunderstanding. We're going to get those handcuffs off you right away." Angela looked at Morrison with the calm expression she had maintained throughout this entire ordeal. "Chief Morrison, I appreciate that. But first, I want to understand exactly what happened here and why." Morrison fumbled with his keys, trying to find the right one for the handcuffs. His hands were shaking so badly that it took him several tries to get them unlocked. When the cuffs finally came off, Angela rubbed her wrists where the metal had left red marks. "Officer Rodriguez," Angela said, turning to face the man who had arrested her, "I'd like you to explain to me what you thought you were investigating." Rodriguez couldn't meet her eyes. Everything that had seemed so clear an hour ago now seemed completely insane. How had he convinced himself that the director of the FBI was a drug dealer? How had he been so wrong about everything? I thought... He stammered, but couldn't find the words to explain his reasoning. "You thought what?" Angela asked. Her voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "I thought you looked suspicious," Rodriguez admitted quietly. "Suspicious how?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "You were in an expensive car, in a wealthy neighborhood, and you were..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "I was what, Officer Rodriguez?" Rodriguez looked down at the floor. "You were black," Angela nodded slowly. "And in your mind, that combination of factors meant I must be a criminal." Rodriguez didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. Park stood nearby, watching this conversation and feeling sick to his stomach. He had gone along with Rodriguez's assumptions without question, and now he realized how wrong they had both been. They had arrested one of the most powerful people in law enforcement because they couldn't see past their own prejudices. The sound of car doors slamming outside interrupted the tense conversation. Through the windows of the police station, they could see two black SUVs pulling up to the building. 4 people in dark suits got out and headed for the front door. "That would be my escort," Angela said calmly. Chief Morrison rushed to open the door as the FBI agents entered the building. 3 weeks after that night in Millbrook, Angela Washington sat in her corner office at FBI headquarters, looking out at the Washington skyline. The red marks on her wrists had faded, but the memory of those handcuffs remained vivid. On her desk sat dozens of letters from police chiefs across the country, all expressing their embarrassment and promising to do better. But Angela knew that promises weren't enough. The story had broken within hours of her release. Someone in Millbrook had leaked it to the press, and by morning every major news outlet was running headlines about the FBI director being arrested for driving while black. The video footage from neighbors' phones had gone viral on social media, showing her being handcuffed and placed in the patrol car. Angela had made a decision that surprised everyone, including her own staff. Instead of trying to minimize the story or sweep it under the rug, she had embraced it. She held a press conference the next day and talked openly about what had happened to her. "This incident wasn't just about me," she had told the reporters. "It was about every black person who has been stopped, searched, and arrested because someone couldn't see past the color of their skin. The only difference is that I had the power to make phone calls that other people don't have." The press conference had been watched by millions of people. Angela had spoken calmly and professionally, but there was no mistaking the anger in her voice when she described sitting in that holding cell. She had talked about the assumptions that Officer Rodriguez had made, and how those same assumptions were being made by police officers across the country every single day. We cannot build trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve if we allow prejudice to guide our actions, she had said. What happened to me happens to ordinary citizens all the time, and it has to stop. The fallout had been swift and severe. Within a week, the Justice Department announced a comprehensive investigation into the Millbrook Police Department. Federal investigators arrived in the small town and began going through years of arrest records, looking for patterns of racial bias. What they found was disturbing, but not surprising. Over the past 5 years, black drivers in Millbrook were 3 times more likely to be stopped than white drivers, even though they made up only 8% of the town's population. They were twice as likely to be searched during traffic stops, and 4 times more likely to be arrested for minor offenses. Officer Rodriguez had been the worst offender. The investigation revealed that he had made over 200 traffic stops in the past year, and nearly 60% of them involved black drivers. His arrest record showed a clear pattern of treating black suspects more harshly than white suspects for identical offenses. Rodriguez was fired within 2 weeks of the investigation. Beginning. Chief Morrison, who had overseen the department during years of discriminatory practices, resigned rather than face the shame of being terminated. The entire department was placed under federal oversight, with new training requirements and strict monitoring of all police activities. But Angela knew that firing a few officers wouldn't solve the deeper problem. She had spent her career studying law enforcement practices, and she understood that what happened in Millbrook was happening in communities all across America. The difference was that most victims didn't have the power to fight back. She decided to use her experience to push for real change. Working with congressional leaders from both parties, Angela helped draft the Police Accountability and Reform Act, a comprehensive piece of legislation that would require bias training for all law enforcement officers, mandate the use of body cameras, and create new oversight mechanisms for police departments. The bill faced resistance from police unions and some conservative politicians who argued that it went too far. But Angela's personal story had given the legislation a powerful narrative that was hard to ignore. How could anyone argue against reforms when the head of the FBI herself had been a victim of the very problems the bill was designed to address? Angela spent months traveling around the country, speaking at police academies and law enforcement conferences. She told her story over and over again, not because she enjoyed reliving that humiliating night, but because she knew it could help prevent other people from experiencing the same thing. I want every officer in this room to imagine that the next person you stop could be someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's sister, she would tell the audiences. I want you to imagine that they might be a teacher, a doctor, a business owner, or yes, even the director of the FBI. Don't let your assumptions about what someone looks like determine how you treat them. The response from rank-and-file police officers was mixed. Some were defensive, arguing that they didn't see color when they did their jobs. Others were more receptive, acknowledging that unconscious bias was a real problem that needed to be addressed. A few even approached Angela after her speeches to share their own stories about times when they had made assumptions that turned out to be wrong. Officer Park, Rodriguez's former partner, was one of those who reached out. He had been placed on administrative leave during the investigation, and while he hadn't been fired, his career in Millbrook was effectively over. He sent Angela a handwritten letter apologizing for his role in her arrest and asking for advice about how to become a better officer. Angela was surprised by the letter, but she decided to meet with Park in person. They sat in a coffee shop in Washington, and Park told her how watching her arrest had opened his eyes to his own biases. "I keep thinking about that night," Park said, staring into his coffee cup. "I had doubts about what we were doing, but I didn't speak up because Rodriguez was the senior officer. I told myself I was just following orders, but that's not really an excuse, is it?" Angela studied the young officer's face and saw genuine remorse there. "The important thing is that you recognize what went wrong. The question is what you're going to do about it going forward." Park had applied to several police departments in other states, hoping to start fresh somewhere else. But he was also taking courses in criminal justice and social psychology, trying to understand the root causes of bias in law enforcement. He wanted to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. "I want to make sure I never make assumptions about people. Again," he told Angela, "I want to be the kind of officer who treats everyone with respect, regardless of what they look like or where they come from." Angela was impressed by Park's commitment to change. She ended up writing him a letter of recommendation when he applied for a position with the Richmond Police Department, which had recently implemented comprehensive bias training programs. Police Accountability and Reform Act eventually passed Congress by a narrow margin, with Angela's personal story serving as a powerful catalyst for change. The new law required all police departments that received federal funding to implement bias training, use body cameras, and submit regular reports on their arrest and search patterns. Angela also established the National Police Reform Institute, a non-profit organization dedicated to improving police-community relations. The institute provided training materials, research funding, and technical assistance to police departments that wanted to reform their practices, but perhaps the most important change was harder to measure. Angela's story had started conversations in communities across America about race, justice, and the proper role of law enforcement. Parents were talking to their children about how to interact with police officers. Police officers were talking to each other about their own biases and assumptions. The video of Angela being arrested continued to circulate on social media, but now it was often accompanied by educational content about racial profiling and police reform. Community groups used it as a training tool, showing how quickly a routine encounter could escalate when officers made assumptions based on race. Rodriguez himself had largely disappeared from public view after his firing. Local news reports suggested that he had moved out of state and was working in construction, though he had never spoken publicly about the incident. Some people felt sorry for him, arguing that he had been made a scapegoat for problems that existed throughout law enforcement. Others believed that his punishment had been appropriate for someone who had abused his authority so egregiously. Angela tried not to think about Rodriguez too much. She understood that he was a product of a system that had taught him to see certain people as threats. Destroying his life wouldn't solve the larger problem, and she took no pleasure in his downfall. Instead, she focused on the positive changes that were emerging from her terrible experience. Police departments across the country were implementing new training programs. Young officers were learning about implicit bias and community policing. Civilian oversight boards were being established to monitor police behavior. It would take years, maybe decades, to fully address the problems in American law enforcement. But Angela believed that progress was possible, one conversation and one training session at a time. On the anniversary of her arrest, Angela drove back to Millbrook to visit her mother. This time, she took a different route through town. One that didn't go past the police station. Her mother had followed the news coverage and was proud of how her daughter had handled the situation, but she still worried about the toll it had taken.